Good evening.
Hey, good evening, Kashe. How are you?
I'm well. Yourself?
Good. Hanging in there.
Good deal.
Hey, Chandler. Hey, Charles.
Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you guys?
Good.
Megan? Does everyone enjoy online platforms with their learning experience? You find it to be beneficial? Or would you rather in person? What about you, Kashe? You prefer in person or online?
I like the online. It's different from other onlines that I had because it wasn't virtual, but I think I'm just accustomed and so used to in person.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nothing like in person. In person is, you just get so much more, from just the interaction. There's the dynamic that's always missing something when it's virtual. But the world is increasingly becoming, this is becoming more of the norm. Kyle, how's it going?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Good, good. Haneen, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Give it a couple more minutes. I think we got a few more people coming in. Is there anyone on the East Coast? Who's that?
I'm in Ohio. So it's kind of
Oh,
east
okay.
of-
What part of Ohio?
Well, I live outside of Columbus.
Okay. Yeah, you're not too far from, well, you're not too far from Chicago.
Yeah, not too far, guys.
Yeah. Anybody in Chicago? And how many people are in California? Are the rest of you like in California? Who's all in California? Kashay, where are you right now?
I'm in Tennessee,
What part?
Memphis.
Okay.
Memphis.
Yeah, I got a sister that lives out in Murfreesboro towards Nashville. You ever been out
Yes.
that way?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
I,
a
I
nice
like
little drive.
Memphis too. Memphis get really good barbecue.
We
And really
do,
good
we do.
soul. Yeah, good soul food, good barbecue.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a cool city.
Yeah, it's been kind of chaotic down here with the passing of Lisa Marie. Like people are like
Oh,
everywhere at the Graceland. So
yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. Have you been to Graceland before?
I have not.
Oh, okay, you should
I
check it out.
pass by it all the time, but I've never actually just visited and looked inside.
Yeah, it's a cool spot. Cool spot. RP, how are you? Welcome to class. RP, are you there? Okay. Nicholas, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Good to see you. All right. I think, hang on. One more person coming in. RP, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Sorry, my internet connection is acting up today.
No problem, it happens. We were just discussing where people are from. Where are you from?
I live in Los Angeles, California.
Okay, gotcha. Another LA person. And Nicholas, I forget, where are you from?
From LA also.
Okay. Yeah, I come out there frequently. I own property in Redondo Beach. So I come out there and kind of hang out in that area, Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach. And then, I'll get up to Malibu too, which is kind of nice up near the campus. I think eventually I'll probably end up out there and just kind of hang out there instead of Chicago. But my kids, I have two small children, ages 3 and 2, Christian and Chloe. And so it's hard to convince the wife to kind of uproot and relocate when you get such a strong support system, with young children, like all of our family is out here, So that's the only thing keeping me from, kind of permanently relocating out there. But yeah, I love it. I love Southern California, and I come out there all the time and, just travel around and stuff like that. But you guys got it lucky. Right now, it's really cold here in Chicago, and it's not fun. Okay, gonna get started here. Has everyone had an opportunity to kind of cover a little bit of this week's readings and chapters? I saw some of your discussion questions from the chapters, but before we start, are there any questions about the chapter or kind of the class so far? Any comments or questions or opinions or anything? Nothing? Do we feel that this subject will be useful to us in our future practices? Yeah? Okay. Well, I mean, the world of therapy is definitely encompassing more of this. This is so important. It's kind of changing the dynamic of therapy, of intake and assessment, including that cultural component is huge. So I think eventually even the DSM, which is starting to cover some of the cultural elements, and we'll talk about that as we go through this week's readings and things, that culture is going to be a big one and kind of revamping a lot of the disorders to include sort of cultural functions and awareness moving forward, and try to remove as much bias as we can. But I want to start this week's course. I want to start this week's course with talking about personal experiences with maybe some of our assumptions, some of our biases, and some of our stereotypes, the real kind of uncomfortable experiences we have or have had, and how that even made us better in understanding different people or differences, or just, sort of a lesson learned in some way, or just how it impacts you rather. So maybe I'll give you guys a couple minutes to think about some personal experiences with any group, right? Any group, because this class is not supposed to be faint of heart. We're supposed to kind of get it all out on the table so that we can become a little bit different than when we came here, and trying to understand what it means to help, right? What it means to help people who are absolutely maybe not like us in many, many ways, right? And to me, it's more of, this has sort of almost a philosophical, ideological component to it, this course, because it's really trying to delve down into changing the way we kind of view the world. And that's extremely, extremely difficult, right? Because we all have such ingrained behaviors, such ingrained perceptions, beliefs, values, and things we hold on to, which are fine. It means we should keep them. But if we are to work in this profession, in a globalized society, multicultural, multi-belief system, values, et cetera, how do we go about helping as many people as possible when there's so many differences? So I think this course is it's really unique. It's unique because it's like the philosophy of differences, and how all of that makes sense to try to be able to help as many people as possible based on those differences. So is there anyone that want to volunteer first to maybe think about some of their honest experiences, and maybe what they learn from it, maybe what they gather from it? It doesn't have to be a negative connotation to it, but rather just what has been your experiences dealing with differences, and how you've gone to address that, and how has it maybe possibly made you a better person for that.
I can start.
Okay.
I think
Yes.
one of my greatest experiences were actually with someone that I thought was like me, African American, same culture, same texture or whatever. But what happened was, we was having a conversation and we got to talking about some things, religion, politics, and just personal stuff. And come to find out that they were nothing like me. They were nothing like me. And it seemed negative at the time we was having a conversation, but after I, went over the conversation and recalled the conversation after the conversation, it actually was a positive thing, because African Americans get stereotyped so much off of just biased stuff and stuff of the past and stuff that seems to be normal that's really not. But I took it as a positive experience, because I didn't think like that person and I didn't view like that person. And it just made me feel better for who I was as an African American, to know that just because African Americans are stereotyped so much, that certain stereotypical aspects that I'm just not a part of, regardless of what anybody else thinks. So it was actually a positive thing, no matter how negative it seemed during the conversation, but it was actually positive. So just because you look like somebody else or talk like somebody else, or, you know, in the same community with somebody, same neighborhood or what have you, that doesn't mean you like that person at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about how many assumptions we have. I mean, think about, number one, human beings are predominantly visual, right? So our first set of information from meeting a stranger is a visual one, right? And so from that visual perception, you know, based on what we've related to other similar visual perceptions dealing with that person, we might come up with all sorts of assumptions, right, about how a person speaks or should speak, you know, what a person either believes in, maybe even what they eat, how they're going to behave, you know, and oftentimes we find out that that's not true, right? I think that one of the tenets of, like, say, Stoic philosophy is that we suffer more in idealism than in reality. Basically, a lot of things are in our head don't match reality when we tend to have an intimate experience with someone, and it totally throws everything off center, because it's like, well, this didn't go how I thought it would go, right? This experience is not how I thought it would be, rather something different, which is the beauty of it all, you know? And therefore, I think one of the facets of the course is changing the way we think of making things into kind of always looking at things to be negative, differences to be negative, rather than differences to be a positive thing, right? Because I think in our culture here in the United States, we may have kind of an inclination towards negativity, towards things that are different other than what we believe to be our groups, as opposed to embracing that thing and be like, wow, that's a very unique thing. You know, I would like to learn more about that, just out of intellectual curiosity, right? So I can understand it more, as opposed to saying, no, I don't want to understand it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, good example, Kashe. Someone raised their hand. Was that Megan? Yeah, Megan, you raised your hand. Yes.
So my example is kind of like a political one.
Mm-hmm.
So during the pandemic and when the vaccinations were coming out, I had a very negative perception of people who chose not to get vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just thought they're ignorant and stupid and, you know, like whatever it was, just really judgmental. And I met this woman I work with. She is first generation Mexican American. She's very white passing. So initially I didn't know what culture she was from at all. And then we started talking, and then, you know, it came out that she was unvaccinated. And I just asked her, I was like, why didn't you get vaccinated? And she's like, I watched the government deport half of my family members. Why would I trust the government with my body? And I was kind of like, you know, that's an interesting perspective. And if I were in that position, I don't know that I would feel any differently, you know, like it really changed my perception. And it was like, you know, whatever people want to do with their body is their choice, which is also something that I believe. So like kind of my ideas about people who were anti getting the vaccine, like that conversation kind of shifted my whole perception of the whole thing.
Yeah.
It was just really interesting. And like, and then we just kind of got into a conversation about government and like her thoughts on it. And it was just really interesting hearing it from her experience, which is very different than mine. You know, it was a really eye-opening conversation.
Yeah, and I think this, you know, is probably one of the recent largest examples we could use is, you know, COVID. And it's a tricky one, right? Because it deals with a virus that could be spread so many different ways. But inherently, you think of, well, a lot of information we receive is through media and social media. And a lot of that We could be misinformed, malinformed, or well-informed, right? It depends. And the media tends to create narratives of fear, right? Because we know fear sells, right? And so maybe we could say the people presenting the information out there is in the business of making money. Therefore, where we get our information, the sources we get them from, we have to be very, very careful and selective on where we get the information from. Because if it's from people who want to make money so that they create more stories from that, right? They don't want the stories to end. They want to make it go as long as they could go for, to capitalize as long as they can off the fear that things can permeate. Second of all, it's a real thing and people died. So we have to be very, very empathetic towards the reality. So it's just a very tricky one. Third, we live in a country where, we believe we have certain rights and freedoms. And I guess we never experienced something like this in such a long time, and especially in modern context, that was just a bit chaotic on what to do and who to listen to. And fourth, everybody has their own views. And who are we to say that one's viewpoints is worse than the next person? All we can say is, hey, that's your view, right? Kind of like I said in first class, we could say like, hey, I totally disagree with you, but I understand, right? So yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, it means there's probably no clear-cut answer to any of that. That's just one subjective opinion based on what they believe is real, not real, the information they got it from, the sources, and a lot goes into that. Whether people were fearful before it showed up, right? That people had fears, integrated in their nurture, their upbringing, their background, or whether people have children, don't have children, whether people have around senior citizens or not, whether people work in healthcare or don't. So it's a very multi-factor thing. And I think that'd be a great sort of research. I'm pretty sure a lot of people doing the research or dissertations on that. But that's definitely, if you're dealing with diversity and multi-cultural elements, that's going to be an excellent example to use because there's just so much information you can use from that. Who else? Who wants to go next? Come on, don't be shy about your experiences thinking about the others. I'm pretty sure you have some others experience. Well, I'll give everybody a couple more minutes, but I would say mine, when I first went to South Africa, I think I may have had some biases about the education systems, let's say American versus South African, right? And really South African has the British education system really big. It has a lot of indigenous education involved, right? And some Dutch education involved. So it's a pretty interesting place, right? You got a lot of the indigenous information, the British education system, the Dutch education system. But I kept thinking like, oh man, I think maybe America might be superior, right? In terms of education, and going there would mean that, hey, I can apply this wonderful intellectualism to these people. And that it would be simple, right? I could look at it and assess it, look at the issues there, and it would be simple, right? The issues are that there's extreme poverty, there's a lot of racial tension, it's been there for a very, very long time. The economic power is held by the whites, right? The Dutch and the British. But the political power is still kind of swayed more towards the blacks. So it's an interesting thing. You say all the money is with the whites, but I guess the politics are with the blacks. And it still doesn't really level out. And then, so going there, I learned a few things, right? I guess my bias was, no, I think when I got there, I was quite surprised. I was quite surprised how simple they think, but in kind of more, I'd say, in almost a superior way. I think we tend to over-analyze and complicate things in our education systems, especially look at the number of laws on the books in America and number of, you can even just look at the DSM and look at how complicated it could be. That they're very simple in how they look at things, but highly philosophical. Like they don't need as many words as we do to explain something. So that for me was eye-opening. The second part was it's not simple when you deal with historical issues of systematic racism and things of that nature. Like it's extremely, extremely complicated, because what you've done is essentially you've created a cultural mindset that wasn't there before, right? You've created something that's gonna stick regardless of, even if you change the economic circumstances, it's still gonna take a very, very long time to undo. It's almost like creating a bad behavior and then expecting it to be solved just from, giving a lot of money or something like that. It's just not gonna happen, So it's almost like the same thing, but it's like a cultural behavior. And so I realize how complicated things can be when you look at it and you think it's simple, and not to present like any sort of American intellectualism or education as superior to other places around the world, because oftentimes you find that that's actually not the case at all. So that's one of my things. Who else? Anybody else want to give an example?
I want to ask a question that may be an example.
Yeah, sure.
Going back to your visit to Africa, I had a person that I worked with. She was from Nigeria, and she would always complain. She said that over here in the States, we do a bad job of representation of Africa. And she was saying that what we see on TV is not Africa.
Yeah, I mean, think of this. I mean, how do I put this? I put it in a simple way. You don't ask a broke person how to make $1 million, right? You ask a person who's made the money how to make $1 million, which means if you don't have firsthand experience going there, as opposed to reading the books, looking at the YouTube videos and all that stuff, you're definitely always going to be missing out on a lot of elements of truth. The biggest teacher in life is experience, right? So even here as I teach, your real world experience will be far superior than this, right? This can help because maybe some things will stay, and we know that memory, only maybe 3% of it will stay, right? But experience count. Yes, when you go there, it is nothing like here. Africa is a continent that's went from, close to 100 countries to 70 some countries. It's a big place, different cultures. They fight amongst each other in the Hutus and the Tutsis, you know what I'm saying? So there's violence against each other. It's just like anywhere else in the world. And you realize this is not a special thing. Anywhere you go in the world, I've been quite a few places, there's tend to be always a minority and a majority, even if they look exactly alike. The people could look exactly identical, speak the same language. There will still be an ethnic majority minority for the most part. You see that. And sometimes the people look completely different, which gives it an even more, I would say, it creates more degree of awareness. So if you go to a place where it's a white majority, Black minority, that's going to be talked way more about than maybe Chinese and Taiwanese, right? Or you could say, things like that. But it does exist, right? And Africa is a place that has extremely beautiful, Nigeria is built up, Ghana is built up, there's 30, 40-story buildings, all types of technologies there. So it's not like here where they market it to be some sort of, everywhere is ancient and the people are just all indigenous, that's the furthest from the truth. I mean, very, very far from the truth. So yeah, it's misrepresentation. And once again, it's there to make money. So it's just like who's saying it and what are they saying it for? And we'll get to that too today when we talk about a little about intent. What are people's intentions? What are our intentions? All right, before we go off, and I'll break everybody off into breakout groups to discuss some of the questions you posed for this week. Maybe give about 15 minutes. You guys could talk amongst that and kind of come with some takeaways from your discussions, from your questions. But before that, any other questions before we go ahead and do that? Anybody else want to give any examples about their political diaspora? I know you guys have some good ones. I mean, come on, we're in America. I know Democrat, Republicans, independents, and some racial tensions and ethnic and immigration and all that. All right, maybe we could pull it out of everybody a little bit more next week. But I'm gonna do breakout groups, talk amongst yourselves, and then we could come back with some takeaways and discuss some takeaways from what you discussed. How's that sound? All right. Let me, breakout rooms would be automatically signed, so it's random. I'm not assigning them or creating them. So whoever lands in the group. I do 4 rooms. All right, going in, so it's 7:30 right now. We'll come back at, well, I'm sorry, it's not 7:30, I'm in Chicago. So it's 5:30 for most of you in Los Angeles or California or West Coast. So we'll come back in 15 minutes. All right, so here we go. Everyone, we're gonna give it one more minute before we all come back in to our main room. So try to wrap it up. Okay, we're back. I'll just go with who is up first up on my list up here. So Nicholas, what did your group talk about? What were some of the takeaways of your discussion? Well, first of all, who were you in the group with? It's just you and Charles?
Yeah, Charles and I.
Well, I'll give
Yeah,
you a chance to speak, then I'll give Charles a chance to speak.
Okay. I mean, we talked about a lot of things. We each went through our questions and asked them to each other and then tried to answer it.
What
yeah,
were your
in terms of-
questions?
What's up?
What were your questions?
Well, first of all, I apologize for my that noise in the background. It's a very loud dishwasher. So for chapter 2, I said, how can therapists best address multifaceted cultural considerations of their clients during initial assessments and ongoing therapy? To which the answer is, I was getting at the addressing model.
Yeah.
And the follow-up was, how can the addressing model be used to inform culturally respectful assessment? So just building on it, basically.
Yeah. Now, let me just, does everyone in the class kind of understand what the addressing model encompasses? Anybody not understand what that encompasses? Okay. Just think it's acronymic, right? It's just, age, disability, socioeconomic status, right? All the demographic information you could have about a person along with some particular details about them. So just think of it in that way. We'll discuss more of that too as we go through our slides, but go ahead, continue, Nicholas. What did you guys come up with?
Yeah. Oh, so an answer to that question, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the first part we said the addressing model, and then the second part, basically just like how comprehensive the model is in terms of like all the different categories that it makes you think about. And yeah, we were also talking about like the idea of culture as an iceberg, and how using this model you get underneath the surface and get to some of the things that clients might not talk about or show as often or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anything you want to add to that, Charles?
So I talked about my questions also.
Mhm.
For chapter 2, I talked about high and low context communication.
Mhm.
And my question is that, are there any advantages or disadvantages for individuals who are in second generation immigrants
Mhm.
using either high or low context? And we come up with, I think with second generation immigrants, they're still new to the country. So they probably would use high context communication
Mhm.
still. Yeah.
Now, you personally, are you second generation?
I think I am first because I immigrated when I was 13. So I think I'm first, right?
Where your family? Where are you coming from?
Philippines.
The Philippines. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, and just maybe from personal experience and observation, what have you seen with?
Yeah, based on my observation, I think I still use more of high context communication. Like I see nonverbal cues and I understand like what they mean or what's happening.
Yeah. Okay. What about Nicholas? High versus low? Maybe you say from your cultural background.
I'd say from like my experience growing up is
Yeah.
low, I'd say. But yeah, just to answer to Charles's answer to his own question, we're also saying where the person immigrated from is also important because like the book was saying, Eastern cultures are generally more collectivist and more context communication. So yeah, we're saying that could impact it also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, second immigration individual would be still acculturating, right? And still adjusting. So it's definitely not going to be an easy task to, try to have the same type of verbiage that, say, here in the United States, we would, or it could be very long-winded and sort of complicated in how we sort of talk about things or express things the way we express. So it's definitely important to understand the country in which a person comes from. Also, what degree of acculturation they're in right now, what level they're in. So you can understand how long they've actually been here to try to maybe assess how well they've acculturated or adapted to this particular culture. So yeah, absolutely. That stuff is all important. Yes, Chloe, you have a question.
Yes, I had a question. So I was understanding the high and low context as not necessarily like needing to understand, I guess, everything about somebody like right off the bat, like for example, like where somebody immigrated from and whatnot, but rather like kind of the communication style that you take. And like within certain groups, people will assume high context when like maybe like you either can assume high context or low context based like on how much you think that you have in common with somebody. And so kind of what we were discussing was that you should almost always lean more towards low context and then lean on direct communication by like asking those very like just like direct questions so that you can not make any assumptions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. No, it does make sense. I mean, if you think about it, context is situational based, right? So we're saying like, hey, are you doing an intake and assessment with someone, or are you just having an initial conversation with an individual, right? So it really depends. But I do agree, you probably want to start off at the basis and principles of trying to understand what kind of context do people communicate in, what makes the most sense with them to express themselves so that they're able to understand. And we do flip-flop, it's not like that someone just stays high context or low context. It's still conditional on the situation and how much degree of communication you've already had with the individual. And over time, if you do have a client, that context can change, right? And say that you tend to meet in the middle somewhere between high and low. So you tend to have a mid context where both people have kind of navigated towards the center to try to understand each other, because sometimes you don't want it to be a one-directional process. Over time, it should be a bi-directional process to where both people meet in the middle so that they better understand each other, because it's a relationship. It's just not one direction. The relationship goes two ways. Go ahead. You were going to say something else.
Yeah, well, okay, I have a follow-up question on kind of what you were just talking about. So like how, like you were just discussing, like it's like a relationship and like, these things sort of happen over time. Like I would agree that like over time in most relationships, like in a working relationship or in like a social relationship, you don't need to like have such direct communication. But something that we were talking about also in our breakout group was like in a clinical setting, like right off the bat, and this goes to like the clinical formulation interviews and like that kind of stuff. But like, it's like, to an extent, you sort of do have to like ask those questions up front, because you can't, like, you get an hour, maybe a week, like if that. And so it's like, even though I agree that I feel like it, like a lot of people are saying like the async work and stuff, like it feels very like, I don't know, like almost like too direct, like for comfort sometimes, but like to an extent, don't you kind of need that like very direct, low context communication, because you don't have much context because you don't know the person?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you need information, right? Is basically what you're saying. You need real life, basic information about things, but the degree in which you start off a relationship will navigate to be whether a person continues having that relationship with you or not. So you don't want to come off too aggressive, but you do want to come off asking basic questions of why, what, where, when, how, who. Those are basic questions you begin off with, right? And so if you come with too many overlapping sort of verbiage or expressions in that, I don't think you get honest answers from a person. You tend to scare them away. So you kind of just subtly ask very simple questions, almost kind of like what you're saying, very simple questions dealing with why, where, who, where do you come from? Oh, that's interesting. Why is that important to you, right? These sorts of things. And then eventually, I think, like I was saying, you eventually move to a mid context where both people could be super expressive, and maybe to the point to where the other person becomes way more expressive than you at some point, so the dynamics can change. The thing is, it's a case-by-case basis. What's going to give you the best information, because it is situational and each individual client is their own individual experiences. They're all different. The best thing is to go with the addressing model. So where you're using the data that you have present, age, ethnic background, sexual orientation, social economic status, you're using that to try to navigate to make the best sense of it, right? Because we can't just read each other's minds. We do have a set of assumptions based on this model and certain theories, as you're always going to have a set of assumptions until you begin to ask simple questions. From simple questions come more complicated questions. Complicated questions, eventually, if you have complicated questions and they get answered, you have a real relationship, right? In which case, we'll talk more about this because it's very dynamic. I don't think there's one cut and dry answer, which may be saying like, hey, I'm asking a question, but I want one answer. And that might not be the case here, right? It may be like, hey, use your best judgment based off the model that's present. But we'll come back. Chloe, who's next? Kyle, who is your group?
It was myself, Haneen, and Megan.
Okay.
And the one, well, we we went through several of our questions, but the one that's kind of sticking with me for some reason is one of the last questions that we were talking about before the end of the breakout, and Henning brought it up, was, you're talking to a client or having a, conversation, interview, whatever you want to call it. And how do you know if the person you're talking to, what they're telling you is truthful? And if it is or it isn't, is there a way you can go about picking up on these things? And, how do you deal with that kind of thing? And I don't know, that's a tough question. Because like I said, I mentioned that, if you're talking to a person who's been forced into therapy, like through the court or a judge or whatnot, you might run into a person who's not so truthful. They might be playing games with you or whatnot. But, your average person, I don't know. I was kind of stuck on it. I've been thinking about it ever since she asked it. But yeah, it was kind of, I thought it was a basic question, but it's an important question,
No, I mean, I think that's a great question, right? How do you know if someone's being honest about expressing their views, if someone's not just going through a process to get through a process and get over the process? And the thing is, we're not mind readers, right? And we're not here to be mind readers. As a hearer, you're here to be a professional, and you're here to help based off the information that you're given. It's one thing if you're a medical practitioner and someone's telling you something, you could go do blood work on them, do the labs and get the data, right? Here's a little bit different. We're dealing with behaviors and maybe some of the actions. So I would say you do have to have a kind of increase your skill set on nonverbal cues, right? Body language, speech patterns. I think by the time you get to that point and you've had several sessions, you should be able to pick up if someone is not being completely honest, or not even in the case of not being honest, maybe just being introverted, right? And maybe the issue is they have a sense of fear. And what we'll talk about in the slides is maybe even lack of trust. And lack of trust could be a cultural thing too, right? That we may not trust people who in this professional business of picking their brain and trying to diagnose and things like that. So I think all that goes hand in hand with building this relationship, right? It's just the foundation of creating trust and building some sort of exchange where a person feels comfortable, because people need to feel comfortable in any relationship to tell you anything intimate about themselves, right? So it's like, well, okay, if someone's not being honest, or I think they're not being honest, is the issue with them, or is the issue with the setting it is in, the situation, or is the issue with me as a therapist? As a therapist, am I not creating an environment or a sense of comfort that allows them to be more expressive? And the only way you can know that is to spend a little bit more time, right? Go through more sessions and try new techniques to see, hey, if I try something different, right? If I throw a curveball out here, what are the results of that curveball, right? So that's the challenge. And once again, we're in a hard profession, right? This is not an easy profession. This is not engineering, right? We can't size up and measure everything. So although sometimes, the answers sound like, well, it sounds very complicated. It is complicated. Yes, it is. And that's why we call it multifactorial, whatever, right? Multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-layered, multifactorial. All these things require a lot of layers in order to come to some good protocols and practices to be able to get good results. Right? And it's not going to be easy to get good results from someone who has a lot of differences than you, right? So, and hopefully, we're trying to work more towards just getting towards that finish line so that it all makes a little bit more sense. We all create our own sense of practice, our own sense of getting and yielding sort of results. And although we may not follow particular models or theories that we're going to talk about, we still can apply a lot of the stuff we learn and add it to our own unique persona to getting there. It still requires you. You are not a robot regurgitating models and theories. You're a human being with your own persona, your own personality, your own character, but you're gonna apply things in different ways with different people based off who you think they are, what they tell you, and their background, so that you yield the best results. That make any sense at all? Okay. Anybody else from your group? Haneen, anybody else wanna have any?
Haneen asked a really interesting question
Mhm.
about, maybe you can rephrase it for me, but it was basically, is there a point where you take cultural and social considerations too far, in that, like, you can't necessarily blame culture and society for issues. Of course, there's like certain issues that, or a lot of issues that it has an impact on, but like, can you take that too far? We all kind of agreed you can, but like, at what point does it become like too much of a crux in your practice, or like, I thought it was an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. We're trying to discover. We're trying to discover what is the value to these differences. And yeah, you're right. We could take it too far if we've already been given information from our clients that is not as valuable as we thought it was, right? That although, someone may have completely different background and look different and different experiences, that their degree in which they see it may not be the level to which we perceive it to be. So it is a factor, but the degree of how big that factor is, because we don't want to overanalyze culture and differences. We also want to take our scientific, practical minds and what we've learned in the DSM and our courses and anything else where we've gotten our education from. We want to apply that so we can understand the value of a person based on what they think is important to them. And, some people will come from multicultural backgrounds and may not be as important, right? I take myself, for example, you could maybe call me an outlier culturally or multiculturally because I've taken up this sort of mode of thinking, this profession, teaching, traveling, being around a lot of different people. And so even in my own ethnic group, right, you could say that a lot of stuff is, I'm more of a neutral person, right? I take a neutral approach because I try to understand not only my particular side, but everybody else's side. So you could come across a person like myself and like, that's important, don't get me wrong, right? I still have the cultural elements, I still participate, but it may not be guiding my life, right? It may not be a guiding factor to what may help me address my own personal issues, right? And so, but you wouldn't know that unless you asked me, have several sessions with me and ask me certain questions, right? Or probably that would come off weird. I don't think it would be expressed from the onset. But yes, so to answer your question, there is a degree to which you take it. But since we're talking about this topic, right, we're obviously exacerbating culture and differences, but we're trying to do it in a way so we could better understand how to get to the point to understand how much a person values it. And if they do value it, how do we not try to devalue it too, right? With our own scientific, rigorous practice that we're gonna convey. Who's up next? All right, Madison, I see you. How was your group?
It was good. I was partnered with Arpi. Is that, I don't actually know how to pronounce your name. I'm so sorry.
RP, how do you pronounce your name? Since I may have
It's
said it wrong.
I was trying to unmute. It's RP, that was right. Everyone's pronouncing.
RP. Awesome. Well, we talked a little bit. The sort of first thing we talked about is sort of how to, even with all the awareness of culture and different cultures and stuff like that, if you're practicing psychotherapist and you have a client with a culture that you do have information about, it's always probably likely and possible that, you know, people even within a culture are not obviously having the exact same experience of their own culture. And so what would be the best way to sort of navigate within your cultural knowledge, not overgeneralizing based on cultural like learning and information. RB, I don't know if you want to add on to that because it was sort of your point, but.
Yeah, cultural competency is something that like I can spiral in, and like one question becomes another, becomes another, becomes another. My question was kind of more vague of like how important is it for a therapist to be culturally competent? Because in the async work, there was like the cultural formulation interview, which was important to get the perception of the problem being presented from that culture's perspective. But there was the cultural syndrome that was also talked about in terms of distress, where it was, I think, in Latino cultures, like within particular ethnic groups is different. And so it was like very interesting for me on like, I've shared a personal experience where I've been to like a therapist, and like I had gone because I wasn't feeling independent, and I'm Armenian. So you're very sheltered, especially as a girl. And I was kind of told like, oh, like move out or do whatever you want to do. But culturally, that's not possible. So I'm like stuck in the culturally competent part of like, how important is it for a therapist to understand that culture does impact your experience, but within that culture, it's different for everyone. Like for me, my parents are very traditional, but like for my boyfriend, for example, he's also Armenian, but they're more modern thinkers. Like as time changes, their thought process also changes. So I spoke kind of like about that during our breakout group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually in one of the slides, there's a diagram, right? And a diagram, concentric circles, right? Circles within circles. And so the center circle deals with nature, our innate individualization, right? What's important to us before we get to all the external factors, family, job, school, etc., and then the general society at large. So yes, we do want to understand a person at their very root, because they can create their own values, right? Their own behavior, their own persona. And then from there, we can understand, well, actually, I would say we can understand more about, hey, where did you come from? And is that important where you come from? Tell me about your family. How was it growing up? On the outside, where'd you go to school? Oh, did you like it there, right? Where did you work? Do you enjoy your type of work? What kind of work do you do? And from there, we could gain like, hey, what are some of the systems you believe in, right? Your political systems, ideology, religious beliefs, values, all the major things. You know, who are the people you follow on social media? Why do you follow these people on them, right? But you're right in the sense that we do have innate individualization, even though we may be pocketed into a certain culture, ethnic background, or group. Our thing, once again, is to try to gauge that. How much of you is important on your individualization, what's innate about you, as opposed to how much is important and valuable to you about your nurture, right? All the forces acting on you. Do you value that more than sort of your own independent thinking? Or do you not think independently, but rather work on more of a collectivistic sort of mind frame? So it's important to know, yes, cultural competency is extremely important. It's really useful, but it's not the end game, right? You still have to dissect and understand the uniqueness of that particular individual at the root, right? And so all of that is important. But for here, yes, to understand, even Kashay gave a good example, right? She talked about how there was another African-American she interacted with, so she already had assumptions about, cultural similarities, and found out that there was a person that, didn't really share a lot of the same things, a lot of the same tokens. But she would not have known that unless she dug deeper through communicating and try to figure that out. So once again, hey, how do you figure it out, Professor Ross? Communicating over a long period of time, right? You may only have an hour with someone. And once again, even though it's an hour, you don't want to ask 1,000 questions in an hour, right? You want to take very, very small baby steps so that you could build trust. It's like any other relationship. It could be a romantic relationship. Nothing comes out very quickly to actually know a person, right? To actually know a person intimately about who they are, what they value, and what they don't value. That takes a very, very long time. So to answer your question, yes, it takes a while. It takes a lot of communication. It needs to be formed over a long time to get those sort of answers, right? But you do kind of got to creep to it. Because once again, it is like you can't make a mistake as a therapist by start moving too fast, even, or going beyond some sort of boundaries, even through the middle of that relationship. And therefore, that person doesn't want to see you again. They no longer feel comfortable, right? You maybe didn't feel that you respected some of their boundaries at that point, right? They weren't ready to share that with you or open up. And how relatable is that to any romantic relationship, right? Not respecting people's boundaries or, moving too fast. So a lot of the same sort of tokens could be taken from relationships we have with any other person, whether it's family or romantic or what have you, or work relationships, and apply to this, but we're just adding that element of cultural difference to it. Okay, who did I miss before we continue on? Kashay, yeah, your group. Who was in your group?
It was myself, Chloe, and Chandler.
Okay.
And our major topic was high and low context as well. But the question we tried to get in at the end before our time ran out was was kind of on chapter 3. How do you really study your client's culture? Like they bring up stuff, and you got like a week or two in between the next section to try to figure it out, and you're not gonna always be right. And then whatever you're studying from, then how it's not being biased, and we was talking about that as well. But they actually have some stuff to say. But yeah, our main topic was just on low and high context, and how we go about trying to study our clients' culture with the information that's given in the little time that we have with them.
Yeah, you can do general investigation, right? You could look out through the internet and through videos and stuff like that. But I say what probably gives you, we're scientists here, right? And so you want to be as scientific as possible and not try to just create your own research out of thin air all the time. You do want to read a lot of peer-reviewed articles on that particular culture, because they'll give more insight, because it will actually be measured, testable items from a particular group, right? Whether they participants were 1,000 people, subjects, or 100 people, you could be like, okay, this particular article discusses these people on 1,000, a sample size of 1,000 people. That'll probably give you more insight, specifically when it deals with diagnoses and things like that, than just general research. But you do want to understand, like, hey, where's that located? I don't even know where that's located at. Where is that country from? What's the history of the country? Yes, that's important. Hey, you guys went through a civil war back then at that time. I got it. Oh, you gain your independence at that time. Oh, man, the unemployment rate is really harsh. Oh, well, you guys had communism, man. That stuff, yes, absolutely. You want to have I would say general information about the history of and the culture, the political dynamics within that culture, the geography of the culture, topography. You live in a mountainous region, you live in flatlands, things like that. All that stuff's important. But when it comes to diagnoses and looking at issues, you always want to refer to peer-reviewed articles as a scientist, as a scholar, as a researcher, because that's going to give you insight. Because as we're going to talk about some of the slides, people are always, there's a lot of cultures, ethnic backgrounds that are misdiagnosed, right? Talk about Black people, right? We're talking about misdiagnosed with psychoses, right? Not considering the trauma that people face from racial disparities and racism on a day-to-day level, which could mean that impact their thinking and behavior, right? So if that's not considered, that's like, man, you really didn't even pay attention to a whole part of like my actual environment that I live in every day, the stress and anxiety I feel, right? And and that's just one example. But yes, general research, where you come from, topography, history, politics, etc. And then you want to go peer review when you're looking at diagnoses, right? Or particular mental disorders in a community, right? And to see kind of why.
But I'm gonna say something else before Chloe and them jump in. But because every person has their own perspective on a cultural. Say somebody was speaking earlier about how it wasn't the rule of the Indians or whatever, but that's what was offered to her. So everybody have like a different perspective on their cultural. So when we talking about cultural, is it correct to say that what we're getting about the culture from that person is correct from their perspective and not always correct of the cultural, and that sometimes a person action and the things that they're doing can be like a Band-Aid, like duct tape. They're using it in a negative or positive way for the things that they are doing and saying and acting out, and some of the diagnoses and what have you.
Yeah. I say first things first, right? Is we're learning as we go along. What we understand that there are a lot of generalizations in the world, right? And so we step back, we zoom out, and we look at the planet just for a second, and we get a more philosophical kind of approach. You're like, oh wow, this is interesting. Human beings have been classified. Classified by who? Classified for what purpose? They've been put into categories and then put into subcategories, and then from there put into subcategories for whatever reason. And the thing is, that doesn't tell the real story, right? These generalizations and classifications, although they're very simple to take on and be like, oh, I figured it out, right? I understand it. That's not the truth. The truth is more complex because we have individual people with their own motives, their own desires and impulses within these groups that don't share a lot of the same sentiments as the general classification of human beings, right? So we need to first try to understand that that's how this all works. People have been classified for what reason? You're like, oh, they've been classified for a negative reason. It's definitely for a negative reason for if it's a majority group classifying a minority group, right? Who's doing the classifying? The people in power are classifying the people not in power. We'd be like, well, that's an interesting concept. Why are they doing so, right? So it's to have a little bit of that first before we start doing all the dissecting of culture and ethnic. We have to have a little bit of basic principles of understanding why these structures, right? These social structures, social constructs are created in the first place. Second of all, Do the people within that quote unquote classification, categorization, do they subscribe to what the people told them they should subscribe to? Or do they reject that and says, no, I have my own individual position on it, my own individual perspective on it? Although most people will still generalize them and lump them all into one big soup, right? And that's our job. And that job is, that's not an easy one. And that's why you guys are going this far in your education. You might just go even further, right? And get your doctorate. And all you're gonna do is try to dissect the smallest slice of something to come up with something that is a real actual fact of something. Because what we find is that we group a lot of our thinking to big blobs, and we try to say, aha, I get it. And it's not necessarily the case. The case is really that it's a case by case, right? But you do just want to have the tools accessible to have a really good understanding of how this all works, stepping back outside of yourself, right? Zooming out outside of yourself and how you see the world, and looking at the different structures in the world and how people got there, and did they accept it? Did they reject it? And like you say, some people do take that acceptance. Hey, I accept what the people have imposed on me, what the majority has imposed on me, because they said so. They said this is how it should go, and I accept it. And my mentality, my behavior, my actions are dictated by whatever they said this category of human beings should be like, right? They basically play into the game. And some people choose not to play into the game, right? But our job is to really try to understand that. And if we are able to help people, if that is a crutch in their life and they feel that they do subscribe to those point of views and it's harmful and detrimental to their well-being, how do we get to a point to where we can help them unlock that so they could just be nothing more than an individual human being making their own independent behaviors, choices, thoughts, right? Because it can be a crutch. And you know, how many people, we know it's a crutch, right? We're not blind. We live in the United States. There's a lot of people who subscribe to what the majority or what the media or social constructs put out there, and they eat it up, and they find that it's more harmful to their well-being and quality of life, but they don't know how to escape it, right? And thus, someone like us who will have this sort of knowledge in the future, helping these people, kind of help people unlock that. So then, you know, we're opening up new pathways in the brain for people to see just a different way of looking at the world, you know? I would say, you know, for myself, I would probably say I was kind of fortunate growing up with an Italian dad, a Black mom. My mom's from Mississippi, born 1935. She experienced an extreme amount of racism. My grandfather, you know, probably experienced something close to almost like having beatings like a slave would, right? Because he was born in the late 1890s. And then having an Italian dad, right? And my dad was an interesting guy because mafia guy, right? And here in Chicago, a guy who didn't necessarily care what people think, right? And so went against all the rules, went against all the norms, didn't do what maybe the group wanted him to do. He didn't subscribe to the point of views and perspective. He was a rogue. So maybe having a little bit of that, of seeing how bad it could be for minorities with systematic racism that harm people, and also seeing how somebody could think completely different and not subscribe to, you know, what people want them to subscribe, maybe gave me an advantage to be more of a neutral, zoom out type of guy and look at just like, hey, what's happening with this species right here, rather than be like, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this, I'm that. Yeah, I don't know if any of that helps, but that's kind of my breakdown of it. Anybody else in your group wanted to say something?
I can say something.
Yes.
Again, I know we kind of talked a lot about like high context and low context. That's kind of the whole conversation that we all had, but it kind of brought some like questions to me of like, you know, I know we were kind of saying that even if you feel like you have a high context, sometimes, you know, there's like a lot of other factors that might contribute to who someone is. And then it kind of, like, I was thinking, like, sometimes, like, how do these cultural questions kind of come up with a client? Because I know, like, sometimes someone might come in with like a problem with their boyfriend, and all of a sudden you're kind of asking them like kind of cultural questions. And it's like, okay, well, like, why are you asking me that? I'm talking about my boyfriend. So I guess it's like, is it like more fluid? Is it kind of like, let's say like a woman kind of comes in with issues in her workplace of like, you know, men putting her down or whatever, then it's like, okay, well, like, how does that make you feel? Have you kind of experienced that out like as a woman in the real world? Like, is that kind of questions that come more fluidly? Or then we were kind of talking about like, do you have like, obviously you don't want to have like robotic questions that you have, but like in that intake of like how do you identify, or like how kind of, I guess, how did those questions come up without like, you know, offending people?
Yeah, I definitely would say that that is a challenge of, you know, trying to be as sensitive to a person's personal life and, you know, who they are, who they think they are, right? What they identify as. But all you can do is do your best with trying to have a little bit of information about the context of the culture in which they maybe subscribe to. And having that knowledge, figuring out, do they subscribe, the degree to which they subscribe to their culture, all right? So you can go process of elimination. You could say, hey, they don't subscribe to maybe the male-female dynamics that will be typical in this particular culture, right? Check that off by a series of questions, right? You can ask, well, how is, you don't have to ask directly, like, well, you know, if you're Puerto Rican, like, oh, in Puerto Rican culture, is it something like that? You're not asking direct ethnic cultural questions, right? Specifically like, hey, do Black people like that? Like, no, typically how that would go. Your job is to have the cultural competency of wherever they come from, right? Because they do come from some sort of background, trying to figure out how much they value or subscribe to the things in that background, right? By asking normal questions, right? What was that relationship like with you and your boyfriend, right? You take all that information and you add on a cultural element to it to say like, okay, well, that's atypical. That is not typical of someone who really subscribed to that culture that way, right? Then you get back, well, okay, is this person a collectivist? Is this person individualistic? Is it more so about the group? Or they're like, no, this person's pretty independent, right? They're more of an independent person. They're thinking on their own. This is not high value to them, these cultural contexts. But what you do want to gauge is that probably the most powerful force in any society is culture. And it's not one that could be taken lightly. We act the way we act primarily because of the cultures that we subscribe to, whether they're prominent, dominant cultures or the subculture. Are you in a skater community? Are you in a Gothic sub-community or subculture? Do you dress a certain way because you subscribe to that, right? Are you in the hip hop subculture? We all subscribe to something to some degree, and it's very, very powerful. It normally dictates how we look, meaning how we dress, how we carry ourselves, may dictate our speech, right? Are you Valley girl? And do you maybe potentially talk like a Valley girl because of that, right? Our point is to try to gauge. Well, we try to do temperature checks to see how much this particular thing is valuable. But we do not want to be foolish to say like, oh, culture is not that important. Yes, in any society, culture is the most dominant, powerful force, right? It's more dominant than a lot of the other forces. It's going to dominate because it shapes what we believe in, right? It shapes our viewpoints about the world. It shapes our generalizations about people, our assumptions about people, our stereotypes, our prejudice. Culture dictates that, right? It's the navigating tool. So that's the point of why it becomes such a big thing. We're like, well, okay, this is probably this most dominating force for people to create their behaviors and shape what they believe and value. But it's not the only force, right? And to what degree is there an individual inside of all of those forces, right? And it's always an individual. There's always an individual in there that likes, that thinks different about some things. But it's very, very important. So how do we get the questions answered? We ask general questions that don't describe ethnicity, race, background, those types of things, right? Not asking non-direct questions to try to get solutions to what it is we're trying to figure out, right? You don't have to go to, hey, and like I said, in Puerto Rican culture, do you guys eat, arroz gandules and stuff like that? Like, but at some point, you can get there, and people will be, like I said, at level of trust and comfort, people will start to express why that's important in their culture. And typically people will tell you, I don't think this is a mystery that people will tell you, well, man, in my culture, this is what we do, right? People will tell you eventually, right? They're comfortable enough to like, this is kind of how it is, this is how I was raised. I was raised this way. So it's not, to me, it's going to be some sort of mystery for so long as you become a therapist. No, eventually it comes out, because it comes out in regular conversations without people having to be a therapist. All right. Quickly, let's try to answer anybody else that got a question before we just go through the lecture quickly, and then we'll go through our immersion experience participation that we have to go through. Any other questions?
I had a comment. It was just that, like, in a lot of those conversations that you were mentioning, when trying to like delve into someone's culture, I would imagine that like only certain only certain types of theories and like techniques are even going to allow for that space. Like, I feel like somewhere in this pre-work they were talking about like narrative therapy, and like I feel like a lot of that would work for like narrative therapy. But like, if you're a clinician that isn't resonating with narrative therapy, for example, I feel like if you're like a behavioral therapist, I feel like it would be harder to kind of some of those probing questions that really delve into somebody's culture.
No, I mean, you're right. Think about like this, Chloe, like this sort of thinking and application in therapy is new. This is not an age-old way of looking, of being inclusive. Even if we go through the slides, we'll talk about how, hey, Western psychology and therapists particularly have dealt with, predominantly have dealt with white men using therapy on other whites, right? To create assessments and directives and protocols. And only now, in recent times, right, we think of maybe the last 20, 30 years, or we're starting to apply these things to even different cultures within Western society. Not forget the East, right? We haven't even tackled that part. We're just now starting to get to the entire Eastern part of the globe, right? But for here, a lot of people who have not been a majority have been vastly overlooked. So this is a new take. Are the models and theories going to apply to each and every? No, they're not. The point is to get information in an intake and during assessment to figure out what's going to work here and what's not. That's how that should work, right? Not like, hey, this is a monolithic model, I can apply these to these people. That's not how that works. How it works is understanding a person first and seeing later on what's going to apply. So you do need information before you can apply any model that you think will work. And you got to have a good reasonable basis on why you think it will work with this particular person based off a cultural element. But it's nothing to where you can say it applies here, applies there. once again, it doesn't apply to all peoples, right? And once again, this is an evolving techniques and practices. We look at the DSM, there's very little in there for culture, right? They're now starting to introduce it. So we're saying the things that actually diagnose people with disorders don't even really factor in culture at all, but now we're starting to come around the corner and introduce culture. Yes, we're at the beginning. We're at the beginning. We're trying to understand this a little bit more. But you do need information before you can apply any of this stuff. And so the point is to get information by building a relationship with trust and communication. Thus, you can look back and see what technique or model could be best used here in this application. Even when it goes to low and high context culture, right? You still need information first, but you do want to have just a sound principle of understanding of what high and low context culture is and why it's important, right? All right, we got 19 minutes. I'm gonna try to breeze through these PowerPoints and then we could just briefly look at the immersion cultural experience. And because that, I believe, is due, I think by the end of the week or something like that. All right, so let me share my screen here. Okay, hang on one second. Let me try to find this. Hold on. Can you guys see my screen?
No.
Okay. All right, how about now? Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Okay. So difficult dialogues, which we've had today, right? We're gonna have some difficult conversation. This is not gonna be an easy task working with people because people have different experiences, beliefs, values, etc., different styles of communicating, speaking, and listening. Attributional bias, anyone know what that is? Anybody know what attributional bias is? Right, think of how we don't factor in the situation when we look at the context of things. We just factor in the interaction, right? We want to factor in the situation in which we have these conversations, and also the situation in which somebody is placed in to create their behavior or traits. So if you want to think of, say, poverty, for example, you want to be like, hey, is this person's social economic status, is that situation a really, really huge factor into why they behave the way that they behave? It very well may be, but we have to consider that in order for us not to have some attributional bias, right? Of just saying that we eliminate that because we think that's a non-factor, when actually it's huge, because a person has to live with that every single day of their life, right? Different agendas. As a therapist and as a client, right? Do people want to be heard? Do people want to be understood? Do people want to be validated? Think of this as therapists and also as students, you know, in your regular life. Are you a person that want to be heard, or do you want to be understood, or do you rather be validated, right? And people communicate in these different styles, and we have to be aware in our assessments of kind of the communication styles that people sort of work in, right? Wanting to be right and to win, right? People in certain cultures live in a dominant form of communication where it's typically they want to win and shut down. It's typically one direction, right? It's about validating what they say and not having an actual dialogue. Debate versus dialogue, right? We know that that's an issue here in this country today, where people just want to win. There's really no motive. There's no intent to have dialogue that goes back and forth so we can understand each other. There's more, so I just want you to understand me and that's it, right? Those statements are predictable and offer little new information, or participants express unswerving commitment to a point of view, approach, or an idea, right? Some individuals may not move from their idea, from their viewpoints or approach. How are you going to work on that? How are you going to work around that, right? Those are difficult to deal with communication. Now, dialogue is the goal to understand. New information surfaces. We're not so unwavering in what we believe in terms of information, right? That we still have an open mindset. That we also have uncertainties about what we're saying as opposed to deeply held beliefs. That we always keep some form of uncertainties because we may not be sure what a lot of this stuff, because a lot of the stuff is abstract in some sense. Right, here's some examples, right? Your words and actions really hurt me. Please understand and acknowledge this. It was not my intention to hurt you with my words and actions. I am a good and kind person, right? Here, what is intent versus what is impact, right? Impact, like, hey, you actually hurt me with your words. Do you acknowledge that you've made a negative impact here, versus someone just disregarding the impact and just saying like, hey, it was not my intentions to hurt you with my words and actions. I'm a good and kind person, but you still impacted me with your words. Do you acknowledge that, right? Is there a self-awareness of impact and versus intent? So we do want to try to understand the difference between the two. Apologies. Consider whether you spend more time explaining your intent rather than focusing on the impact of your apology. In some sense, so talk about philosophy again. It's kind of Stoic philosophy. It's like the virtue of doing good for goodness sake, as opposed to having a fixation on the fact that you're doing something good, right? So it's acknowledging how things could hurt, how things feel to another person based on their perspective, their shoes, as opposed to us being in our shoes, trying to constantly explain our intent, right? rather than like, hey, apology would suit this particular situation well for apology's sake, because a person, it may be beneficial for them, rather than trying to dissect a million ways why I need to apologize. Right. I think in one of the TED Talks I saw a long time ago, I think they call it the platinum rule, right? Instead of the golden rule, right? The golden rule is do unto others as you would do unto yourself. One of the speakers spoke on the platinum rule. Do unto others as they would have done to themselves, right? As they would want to have done to themselves, right? Not necessarily focusing on you, what you want or how you think it should go, but rather like, hey, how does this person impact this person based on what they're telling me, how it impacts them, right? So are you listening or are you talking to them? There's a difference. That's adapted from this website, which deals with differences and changes. There's their foundation, and that's their main focus, how to mitigate. Assessment diagnosis. If speaking is silver, then listening is gold. Most of your information you'll find out from a person is from listening. It's not from necessarily having a focus on what am I going to say? Because the more you listen, the easier it gets. The more you listen, the more you will know what to say based on what's being told. And like I say, the first thing is to build trust. You build trust, you build comfort. You build comfort, you build an open line of communication. Cultural assessment, framework of a client's identity. How do people identify themselves? If I were to ask you guys, how do you identify yourselves in multiple categories? You would say, I'm this, I'm that. Hey, I'm a student. Okay, that's interesting. That must be important to you, right? Hey, I'm a this, I also do that. Hey, by the way, I got this, I got that. I'm going to take that information back. You spoke on this for a reason. You spoke because it was of value. If you didn't speak on it, I'm going to have to assume there may not have been no value until a later date, until maybe later it comes out that there's some other information that's valuable to you. So we all identify ourselves, right? In different ways. Cultural explanations of illness experiences and help-seeking behavior. We all, some people are more open about illnesses or acknowledging about an issue. Some people are not. Some people, based on their cultural background, that may deem to be a weakness, or that may deem to be a failure of some sort, or just some sort of oddity, or may go against a sense of beliefs or something. And so we have to kind of extrapolate that information too, how that works with that person. Cultural meaning and adaptive functioning of social context. That was talked about with Charles, like second generation. Hey, how adaptive or culturative in the language or context and high and low that a person is in at that particular point, right? How adaptive is that person thus far in their new culture, right? Have they adapt fully? Do they feel comfortable within this culture? Are they in fear of this culture, right? In social context, you can find a lot of information from a person based on that degree. And cultural elements in the counselor-client relationships. And like I say, it's not just talking to a person about them. A relationship goes both ways. You think someone's not going to want information about me if I'm asking 1,000 questions about them? That's not a relationship. That's something else, right? They're going to want context about like, hey, Dr. Ross, like, hey, tell me, what about you? Like, you like riding motorcycles? Really? Yeah, I like riding. Where'd you grow up? Yeah, I grew up here. This is, that builds comfort, because now you have information about the other person too. And that's a real relationship. It's not just no one having information about me and me having all the information about them. That's not how that's going to work if you want to be effective, right? And that's going to speak a lot. Like if a person's asking me 1,000 questions, I'm going to find that to be a plus. That means that person wants to know about me. That's awesome that a person wants to know about me. They feel comfortable at that point, right? It's going to be odd if someone speaks only about themselves and never asks questions about me. Stimulus of the how of intake and assessment, right? Stimulus value of a client, therapy and agency, cultural norms of a client, body language. We talked about high and low context, history and trust of with systems of power, broaching differences. We only got 4 minutes here. I'm gonna try to get through. So we may have to come back a little bit towards this, but I'll end off on this. We talked about this, organic factors and influences. You got your nature here, right? Those are organic. Eventually, you're going to be a human being that has independent thoughts, behaviors, feelings, etc. Then you have your internal factors from this, which create your personal values, beliefs, skills. That all comes from you. Outside of that, external factors, right? Your family is next. Where did you grow up? Mom and dad, your caretaker, your guardian, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be the most powerful influences behind that, right? Family value, norms, expectations. From there, school and local community, where you live is extremely important. It's going to dictate probably a lot of your behavior, how you dress, some of the resources that you have. So your lifestyle is going to be based off this. The stuff that you have versus don't have is from this. And then your wider society, right? Culture, media, global economic conditions, right? Political factions, all these sort of things. That's going to come from here, right? What do you like? Who you follow? What politics you subscribe to? And what do you hope to be economically? I will briefly bring up this. All right, can you guys see this? The document? No? Oh, okay. I just brought this up. Anyway, all right. So the cultural immersion documentation that provides verification of immersion experiences when you submit your reflection papers. So everyone understand what's expected of them for the immersion experience? Okay. All right. So it's intended to address educational experience. So you're going to find something to immerse yourself in and a culture that is not your own, right? Other than your own. And you're going to submit what you've learned and everything from there. You know, what did you observe and what kind of experience that you have with this population, et cetera, et cetera. That's all in the syllabus. But I just want to make you guys know that that's going to be due, hopefully get that in by the end of the week, right? Or before next class at least. And also email me before you actually engage in it. You know, I just want to make sure it's not something off the rails or something that's going to be too culturally sensitive or something like that. Yes.
I think on the syllabus, is it, I don't think it's next week. I think it's the 31st of January. Is that correct?
For the immersion?
Yeah. The immersion reflection.
Oh, let's see.
I can pull it up too, but
let's see here.
That's what I have too.
What is the date on that?
The 31st of January. So 2 weeks.
Okay, so 2 weeks. All right, well, good. Thanks for notating that. Well, at least by the end of this week, get me your ideas, right? So I could go ahead and improve them. So just shoot me an email and say like, hey, you know, I've had a couple of you already send me stuff. Like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that? How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, yeah, so get that in before, yes.
I was just gonna say, can you give a couple of examples that students have maybe done in the past of like experiences that they did within a culture?
Yeah, I mean, people have went to concerts that are they're different culture. People have went to conventions of a different culture other than theirs. People have went to some social engagement. I don't think it has to be anything huge. If you're thinking something huge, it could be any sort of social engagement where you're able to observe another culture and pick up some sort of information from that, right? So I would say any sort of social engagement that you're able to have a genuine sort of assessment of a lot of people of the same culture other than yours. Make sense? And you could get
Yes,
as
thank you.
creative as you want, you know, so that's the point of email me something that you're thinking about, and then I'll be like, hey, this sounds pretty reasonable, right? Or this doesn't sound so reasonable. Sounds good? All right, if there is nothing left, I will let you all go, and you have a great evening, and I'll be talking to you soon. How's that sound? All right, I'll talk to you later, you guys. Have a good one. Bye.
Professor, I actually have a question on the group assignment. I don't know. I think I'm kind of confused with the way the syllabus is set up. So the cultural immersion is what we're doing individually, correct?
Yeah.
And the cultural informant is what we're doing for the group assignment?
Correct. I'm gonna
Okay.
pull it up right now. Hold on, let me pull it up. All right, here's the group presentation I'm looking at. Students will choose an ethnic group, right? So you and your group partner will choose an ethnic group. After choosing a group to research, the group should also choose an intersecting identity, gender, sexual orientation, religion. You should choose to explore a mental health issue within that group, or a therapeutic treatment that you want to use related to the particular group, and present your findings. So the research informs practice is the group presentation. Okay, that's the one that's group. Now, the ones that are individual is a cultural immersion. The sociocultural self-study, which is going to deal with you studying really your own sociocultural heritage. That's individual. And then also know the cultural informant project is individual too. So the only one that's group is where you're gonna research informs practice, where you and your partner will choose an ethnic group, and then you will look at an intersecting identity, you know, in that group, their gender, sexual orientation, religion, social class, what have you, and choose to explore either an issue with that group or a treatment with that group.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, that's the only one that's gonna be group related.
Okay, and this is due week 9, correct?
Yeah, okay, group presentation starts week 6, all the way through week 9, which means that one group per class session will present.
So we actually should be done with this by the end of week 5.
Yep, by the end of week 5. But I'm glad you mentioned that. Next class we'll go over that too, so that everybody's kind of aware,
Okay.
And then I guess, I'll try to figure out who's gonna go first, second, third, and fourth. But really we'll end group presentations week 9. So 6, 7, 8, 9 is when one group will present each week.
Okay. And I also had a question. I didn't want to take up the class time, but I had a question in watching the videos that we did, and I got to go back and post my questions. I totally forgot to post them. But on one of the videos, it was 2 videos that we watched on section 233. We was watching the video, and the question came up of myself. You know how we ask clients if they may be feeling suicidal, if they want to hurt themselves or what have you. Well, when I was watching the video, I think the thing that was popping in my mind is you'll get people who say, no, I don't feel suicidal, I don't want to kill myself, but I often wonder what it would be like if I wasn't here.
Yeah.
Is that something that we should take seriously into consideration that may possibly later form suicidal thoughts? Or is it just the idea of how would they survive if I wasn't here?
I mean, I think that, you know, suicidal ideation of people just formulating ideas about suicide, what it would be like to end one's life. I definitely think if that topic comes up and people, your client does state that they have had thoughts about that, obviously we know that thoughts can manifest itself into reality at some point. So therefore, it's our job to really kind of, you know, not to be overly aggressive, right? Because in trying to dive into how real the threat is, right? Versus just some sort of fanciful, you know, thinking about it, you know, which we probably all have to some degree. Our job is to really kind of assess how real that threat is, right? And that's going to be a tricky one. But I think we'll talk more about that, I think, in a few more chapters, because how different cultures view suicide and how realistic they view it, you know, that's going to be something we're going to have to look at too. It has a cultural element to it too, right? Some may be more susceptible and see that as a badge of honor, while others may see that as the worst thing ever, right? That their religious belief, we think they're automatically going to hell or something like that. So, yeah, it's probably too difficult to kind of get into right now, but I think if that's an awesome question you asked. It's probably one we need to address with a full class around, so we could kind of juggle around that.
Okay.
But we'll definitely talk about that sometime in the near future, but I appreciate you bringing it up, Pasha.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for
All
your
right, have a good week. I'll see you later.
Good night.
Good night.